Welcome to the Food Revolution Summit, where we explore how you can heal your body and your world with food. I'm Ocean Robbins, and the interview you're about to see is with Dr. Columbus Batiste. Dr. Columbus Batiste is a board-certified interventional cardiologist, assistant clinical professor, and regional chief of cardiology for Southern California's Permanente Medical Group. Dr. Batiste aims to provide long-term solutions for chronic diseases by focusing on nutrition, stress reduction, and exercise. Dr. Batiste has spearheaded a groundbreaking virtual cardiac rehabilitation program in collaboration with Samsung Technologies, which is benefiting over 15,000 patients. Recognizing the connection between individual health and community, he co-founded the nonprofit Healthy Heart Nation. Their mission is to address disparities in education, business, justice, and health, known as social determinants of health. Dr. Batiste is a sought-after international speaker on the transformative impact of whole food plant-based nutrition, and he is eagerly anticipating the release of his first book, Selfish, A Cure for a Stressed and Broken Heart. In the interview you're about to see, we'll be talking with Dr. Columbus Batiste about why we need a food revolution, heart health, why it can be good to be what he calls selfish, and the power of lifestyle medicine. Columbus, thanks so much for joining us.
Of course. How are you?
I'm well. So glad to be with you. Let's start out by talking a little bit. You're a dad.
I am.
Right? And you're raising kids in a toxic food culture.
Yes.
Tell us about the struggles that parents go through trying to raise kids in this society.
Yeah. Wow. That's a mouthful, to say the least. And so I'm fortunate. I'm a dad first. Or I should say my wife would say I'm a husband first. But I'm a dad, and so 18-year-old and 16-year-old. And I'll tell you one of the biggest struggles, I'd say, not so much when they were younger, but as they started getting into the preteen years, and especially the teen years, is really peer influence. And just this sense of wanting to be a part of the group and the norm and not wanting to be different. And so that means when they're at parties, that means some of the foods, that there's a strong desire and trying to balance that. That was really a hard part. Mm-hmm. One of the things the approach that I took with my kids during this time was to really work on just the core fundamentals, trying to make food fun and tell them they would come to my lectures. So they would hear about the health benefits from it. But it was important for them to learn that it can actually taste good too as well. And ultimately, as they've grown older, I've left the decision up to them. But the wonderful thing is that the seeds that I planted, they're starting to take root. And so despite the weeds that come in from other outside influences, those roots have taken hold, and I'm seeing them really stay strong and stay true to things.
When you see ads for sugary processed foods aimed at children, what goes through your mind?
I'm really, as I've gotten older, I'm more angry about it. I never thought about it until I had kids. And then I thought about it when I had kids. But as I started digging into the research of where the advertisement, for obvious reasons, is very intentional. And it's intentional to influence the kids because we understand that food is power. And so in a lot of situations, parents who are stressed, they use food to console the kids or to control the kids, to act a particular way. And the advertisers know this. So they're getting the kids to partake and want to eat certain things. The worst part is that being African American, I've become grossly aware of the disparities in terms of the burden of advertising inside of communities of color that's disproportionate. And one might say, well, how is there disproportionate advertising? Advertisement is advertisement. But when you're seeing billboards that are at increased clip inside of certain neighborhoods, when you're seeing magazine articles, when you're seeing television, and we understand the research that goes into those things, that they're really targeting certain groups and kids, that's problematic because they're planting seeds that everyone's going to build upon as they get older of brand recognition. that now they're in schools, that now they've seen this in their favorite sports athletes advertising for it, or they're musicians and they're saying, I want to be just like them. And so it's a huge harm from my perspective in terms of what we're doing for our future, for our kids.
Tell us about the health disparities along race lines.
Yeah, I mean, it's nothing new anymore. So I think COVID has really just unveiled the hideous scab that exists inside this country in terms of health disparities. And when I look at health disparities, I always try and start at a 30,000-foot level. And we see that Americans actually, as a whole, have a stark health disparity compared to other countries. We're some of the sickest individuals globally in the world. But when you look on a microcosm level, we see that people of color unfortunately live sicker and die sooner in nearly every single marker, whether it's diabetes, if it's cancer, if it's heart disease, if it's high blood pressure. But what's interesting is the fact that that's not the case. You can take those same individuals in when they're at their own home country before they migrate over to the United States. The burden of disease is less. So we know there's something there, and that something typically lies in the food choices.
Tell us a little bit more about that. When people migrate here, you said
Yes.
they have less disease, and then they come here and they get sicker.
Yes.
Well, tell us about that, maybe an example or two, and what changed.
Yeah, so I mean, we see it. I'll start first. When we look at Asian women, the incidence of breast cancer is markedly lower before coming to the United States. After the United States, we see a higher burden. We look at people of African descent. What's interesting, there's been several studies, the most recent of which was probably about 3 years ago. Looked at African American men and women who we know have a disproportionate, very high burden of high blood pressure that lends itself to kidney failure, stroke, and heart failure. What's interesting is that if you look at immigrants rather, from Africa, they have the lowest blood pressure, lower than even Caucasians. When you move to the Caribbean, it's slightly higher than in Africa, but when you come to the United States, the disproportionate burden. So it tells us that there's not a genetic predisposition for this. It tells us that there's something that's going on, whether or not it's in the air or in the food or in the culture, something is happening that raises the blood pressure. And we see the same thing, whether or not we look at the Tarahumara Indians, and we're looking at the incidence and burden of diabetes and obesity. When you compare from the same genetic background, those who have migrated and live in Mexico and have a predominantly plant diet versus those who are on reservations and eating the standard American diet and highly processed and refined FDA approved and subsidized foods, the burden of obesity, the burden of diabetes is disproportionate.
Let's talk about dairy. Dairy products are heavily marketed. They're considered a food group in the United States. Not everyone can digest them.
No, I personally didn't realize I couldn't before I became enlightened in terms of with health and nutrition. I had a big struggle with it. Didn't really recognize it as an issue and wondered why I struggled, even in medical school. And so we see this disproportionately, mostly inside of individuals of color, but we're seeing this across the board, that this lactose intolerance that's there. I think the concern is the fact that it's widely mandated in some instances, right? And in other instances, promoted as if it's the answer for everyone, when the large portion of the world is intolerant of dairy. Mm-hmm. And that's where it becomes an area of concern. That is it those in power who are not affected, that's the reason why? It would seem that way, based on the fact from a standpoint of money. That plays a role. So it's a major issue. It's a major issue as it relates to why, when we look at a domino effect, that if as a child, if I'm unable to digest my milk and they say I need to drink milk, what's going to happen when my stomach is disrupted? When now I may have allergies that exacerbates asthma and I live in environments in which there's pollution and noise. I'm not sleeping well. Now I can't pay attention in school. And I have this combination of effects that happen. What's my academic achievement going to be like? What's my level of engagement going to be like? And so we have to understand that every single thing that we do has an equal and opposite reaction.
Statistically, people of lower income are more likely to be exposed to traumatic events in life, whether it's environmental factors or violence or other dynamics around them. Poverty tends to make it harder to protect oneself from
Yes.
difficult circumstances. And statistically, people who are of lower income tend to be more dependent on unhealthy foods for a lot of their calories.
Yes.
Can you speak to, obviously there's a negative feedback loop that can set in there, but can you speak to the positive feedback loop that can set in when somebody, even somebody of very low income in a difficult circumstance, starts to nourish their body better? Does it make it easier to be resilient in the presence of trauma or crisis or pain?
Absolutely. I mean, well, I think it's multifactorial. One of the things that we see is that there's huge, just like we're having a conversation here, there's so much power in connecting with someone. And what that's been shown to increase the telomeres, which are the ends of the DNA chains, that's a proportion of longevity. But we see food impacts that too as well, that by transitioning that we can extend and we can transform our epigenes as well as our telomeres. And so the food becomes important inside of individuals who are suffering with these ACE or adverse childhood experiences. And as you mentioned, they're just prevalent on multiple facets that are there. And when you empower individuals, right, the fruits and vegetables and the whole grains, there are studies that have been done looking at this. There are studies that have been shown as it relates to prostate cancer, as it relates to breast cancer, in extension of these things, these telomeres in these particular instances. So we see the food and the power of food, it's expansive, and we're learning more about it. And so some may say, well, is this the answer to everything? Is it just like I can use this for every single thing that's out there?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not everything, maybe not ALS, but we see it in so many different disease states. And the issue is that even if it does not help completely to reverse or to eliminate, we know that it's moving towards an improved state of health, which means functionality, which means health span, which is important to all of us.
You're a cardiologist.
Yes.
And can you tell us a little bit about the journey from mainstream cardiology to lifestyle medicine in your life?
Yeah, well, I still do practice mainstream cardiology. You know, it's important not to exclude,
Mm-hmm.
but in the appropriate situation.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, like everyone else, there's always an origin story. We all have an origin story of some sort. And my origin story really began with my dad. It began actually preceded my dad by watching, I think my first experience was watching my grandfather who suffered with Alzheimer's. And I was about 12 or 13. And so seeing just the impact of Alzheimer's on not even my grandfather, but my mom and my grandmother and myself, and how the mood would shift and change there from a sweet, passive man to one who was aggressive and angry. I felt like it was the worst disease in the world. Now, fast forward, I'm a practicing cardiologist, and I'd have patients say, okay, doc, what should I eat? And I felt really ill-equipped. I felt like if I was offering solutions no different than my wife's cousin's sister's husband just saying anything, right? And so I felt as if I needed to do research. So that's planted seeds. And then when my dad suffered with diabetes, and he passed away the same year as my father-in-law, who suffered with end-stage renal disease as a result of high blood pressure, that was it. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. I knew that there was something else that had to be there. Mm-hmm. And that's what really started the passion to learn and to read and to explore and to figure out, is there a better solution? Mm-hmm. And so that was really the beginnings. And that was hard to translate that from that foundation into action. Was actually a hard step, because this was before the likes of Kim Williams was president of the American College of Cardiology to say this, or it was a strong advocacy for it, or before President Clinton made reference to Dean Ornish and Dr. Esselstyn about things. And so I was afraid that being an African-American interventional cardiologist that's easy to pick out of a lineup, that I'm that guy who's actually recommending something that's odd. And I'll never forget the first person that I told them to engage in this. I didn't even have an elevator pitch. I didn't have anything. All I had was, okay, read this book, and you should make a change. That's all I said. And the amazing part was they made a change and had tremendous benefits. And then it was a domino effect from there. And I knew that this was something I was obligated, that I had to do. And I felt as if, a large part, that it was a sort of penance for my ignorance or lack of knowledge as it pertains to my dad and pertain to my father-in-law and what I maybe could have done in trajectory in terms of changing the trajectory of their life and their health span.
Heart disease is by far the number one killer on the planet.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit to the statistics of that? And also, how do we wake people up to the urgency of it? Because it seems like people hear that, but they almost tune it out. It's like old news. We've been hearing about it for so long. Can you talk a little bit about the urgency?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the issue is the fact that you never know, why is it that we have insurance? Why is it that we have alarm systems? Because of the unexpected. And so the issue with heart disease, we're complacent because we don't recognize that we're suffering with heart disease right now. That heart disease doesn't begin at the time that you have a heart attack. So yes, on an annual basis, over 3/4 of Americans have heart attacks. There's roughly 875,000 heart attacks that happen annually in the United States. A third of those are from second and third, fourth heart attacks. And so the issue is most people they believe that heart attacks happen from areas of blockage of 70, 80, 90%. So I'm not having symptoms, I must be okay. That means I have time. And I tell every patient, and when their spouse or significant or loved one is there with them who doesn't have coronary disease, I said, the only difference between the two of you is that you know it and you don't know it. Most heart attacks happen from areas of 20, 30, 40% that would never show up. Americans don't understand that. And what's important is that a treatment like stents or open heart surgery doesn't prevent a heart attack or death in that instance for someone stable. Only in the setting of a massive heart attack can it do that. And what that means is we have to attack the accomplices that come along with it. Diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, sedentary lifestyle, poor sleep, all these aspects that are there are stress in our lives if we really want to have a chance at staving off coronary artery disease. Now, when we do that, there's power. So I believe the complacency is based off of the perception that it can't happen to me, I'm too young, and the misconception that I have to have severe symptoms as evidence for it, as opposed to having silent heart attacks, which are well described in literature as far as happening on a regular basis.
As a cardiologist, when you prescribe healthy diet and lifestyle to your patients, do you have the feeling that that is as effective or even more effective than many of the medications?
I do, but just like medications, so I'll start first with the medications. Our medications are only as good as when a person takes them. A diet prescription is only as good as someone who's going to follow it. So the amount of effort that person puts into it will yield the results. And so I am confident, I've seen it in practice, I've seen it in literature, that a person who pours into their nutritional journey, that they are able to make tremendous changes in the absence of medications. Not everyone. It's never a one size that fits all. But for clinicians, part of the problem is we can identify if a person's taking their medications on the basis of refills. I never know if you're really truly just telling me what I want to hear as it relates to nutrition. So for my patients, I really hold them to the fire. I'll have them keep journals. I'll have them use an application on their phone that will actually track and record and ask them to, hey, okay, listen, let me see. Show me what you've eaten. Plan out. I want you to plan in advance that you know what you're eating. It gives me a little bit more comfort. And then the key is this, Ocean, is that you have to inspect what you're expecting. So in any instance, if I'm using a therapy of medications, I'm going to recheck for that parameter within 2 or 3 months. I may recheck a cholesterol panel. I'm bringing in for blood pressure. We need to do the same thing with nutrition as what I do for my patients and see, are you really fulfilling what I'm expecting with the prescription?
A lot of people think they're eating a heart-healthy diet, and they may actually be misinformed. What are some of the most common mistakes you see people making who think that they're doing it all right?
I think simply put, they're eating foods that say they're healthy. If you're eating foods that have to say that they're healthy and claim, they probably are not healthy for you. So we don't see a label on fruits and vegetables and whole grains that say, healthy, eat me, right? It's going to be on boxed food, canned foods, frozen foods. And so I try and encourage patients to really move towards that solely, which means a whole food plant-based diet. And that's your primary goal that you can do on a regular day in and day out basis. That's the biggest mistake that I see folks make.
What type of dietary pattern promotes cardiovascular disease?
We see an animal-based, dietary pattern. Now that can fall under the category of a paleo, ketogenic. And why do I say that? When we look at large-scale studies, we see consistently the consumption of red meat and processed red meat are the number one assailants. They're top one in terms of like killers that are out there. But we also see from a standpoint of inflammation, which is an area of concern, and dyslipidemia, that chicken and turkey and white meats can also trigger the same process that's there. We're learning so much more about this. So dietary practices that focus on this solely as the main portion of the food consumption is the problem. Now, many patients will sit there and they'll say, well, you know what, I lost weight on an animal-based keto diet and so forth, and my diabetes temporarily improved. And my response is, short-term gain is long-term pain. And oftentimes what we're seeing the shift is probably because you removed yourself from processed foods. The standard American diet is, bar none, with overconsumption of sugar, salt, and fat are the main contributors that are there. So removing that will yield some metabolic benefits, but it won't answer the question of how can I achieve true health. We know that involves eating real food that's alive and food from the earth.
So tell us about some of the particular foods maybe that are especially beneficial for cardiovascular health.
Oh, yeah, now we're in my wheelbarrow. I love these. So when we're looking at dark green leafy vegetables rich in dietary nitrates, we're looking at Swiss chard, and we're looking at spinach and kale and mustard greens and collard greens and bok choy. These are extremely powerful. But I love beets. So a wide array of beets too as well are extremely important. Why? Because it's delivering that dietary nitrates that are there. Why that's important is they help to dilate the vessels too as well. So you're not only getting the fiber content that helps kind of wash away the cholesterol that's there, and you're eating cholesterol-free foods, that now you're also having foods that are enriching, plus a rich array of phytonutrients. So we're looking at those. We're looking at beans, superpower. Right? It gives you protein, gives you resistant carbohydrates too as well. It's the stuff that blue zones are made of, that we understand the power of beans really in terms of our body from that resistant carbohydrate and the fiber rich. Look at grains. That fiber rich grains are extremely important. Having more color is extremely powerful. Red rice and bulgur and wheat and buckwheat and brown rice, all these things are extremely wonderful to the palate as you begin to eat it. Eating fruit, the berries are powerhouses. So blueberries, raspberries, strawberries, enrich in antioxidants. They help lower the blood pressure, improve the memory too as well, helping stave off diabetes. So we're seeing power in so many fronts as it relates to this heart-healthy diet that's focused on greens and beans, and accentuating that with the allium family, which includes onions and garlic because they decrease the stickiness of platelets, that are there, and adding mushrooms that are going to help with cancer too as well, adding seeds because we want antioxidants and omega-3s that are going to help with our memory and stave off Alzheimer's.
You have a forthcoming book called Selfish.
Yes.
And so I'm curious if you could tell us about what selfish means to you. It's an acronym, of course,
Yes.
but you also chose it for a reason.
Yes.
So tell us about what the acronym means to you, and then also let's go into the letters.
Yeah, I think whenever you choose a pathway in life, whether or not it's to complete a course of work, study in school, if you commit to something at work, if you're choosing a diet, your health as a priority, to some degree it requires you to be selfish, which means you have to prioritize yourself in that particular instance when others may not necessarily want you to. They may want you to do something else, and that lends you away. So selfish, it started with that concept, because that was something I had to do to get through medical school. And I avoided parties and other things like that to kind of stay focused. But when I look at selfish, it really encapsulates a lot of the things I've spoken to patients about. And that's where the acronym comes into play, that the S stands for spiritual. And so we understand from a spiritual standpoint, we're talking about prayer or meditation breathing, restorative, focused breathing, and what that does for enriching the prefrontal cortex, our decision-making zone, helping to lower the stress, the impact it has on the lining of the vessels is so powerful that it makes sense. It's like a keystone habit, the beginning of things. The exercise is not necessarily Taibo if you're from the 80s or Jane Fonda aerobics or any of that stuff. It's just simply walking. It's moving. It's getting neat, non-exercise activity, thermogenesis, moving around. It's powerful. Gardening, the simple things of life is what the longevity studies have shown. Then we move over, the next layer is love. And love is my favorite one, right? And everyone says, I used to joke saying I was a love doctor. I was going to become a cardiologist. I wanted to be a love doctor, right? But the issue with love is that love is not a noun. It's not static. It's a verb. It's an action word. That's forgiveness. It's gratitude. It's volunteering, giving of yourself. And what the studies have shown is that does more for you as the individual than it does for the other person. That's where you get power. The F stands for food, which we've already spoken about. The I stands for intimacy, of relationships, of connectivity, of having someone that you can lower the barrier and make yourself vulnerable. Because studies have shown that there's power that when we can have connectivity, we can actually extend our telomeres, that we can actually impact our longevity when we do this. The S stands for sleep, right? And sleep can be a bear for all of us at times. But sleep is so important. A third of our lives is not wasted time. It's an important time for cleansing our body, restoring our body. And there's so many analogies I can give with that, and so many references regarding our hunger, our weight challenges, our diabetes, our heart disease, our stress, tolerance, that come from sleep. And then last is H for humor, the joy of life, and the power that exists with just a simple smile. That simply smiling can lower your blood pressure. It's crazy. That simply smiling can become infectious. And so those are the things. That's what selfish stands for, because it's a prescription to cure a stressed and broken heart.
So spirituality, exercise, love, food, intimacy, sleep, and humor. Wonderful. Love it. What a great combination. There's a prescription for a happy life, isn't it?
It is. You may not hit all the pillars all the time, but you're striving for it, right? And so every day we can choose something to laugh about. Every day we can try and move more than we sit. Every day we can focus on what we eat and try to make ourselves vulnerable to have a connection with someone, And I think that that's important when we begin that process of saying, did I hit my selfish pillars today, right? And when you do it, all of a sudden you realize, guess what? I am a little happier. One little thing is I had a good friend, colleague of mine. I hired him, a nurse, oversees the department. I said, man, Sean, how you do it? Sometimes I'm just frustrated on the phone. He said, Doc, you just have to answer the phone with a smile. He said, if you say it with a smile, it's funny, everything follows suit. And he's so right, because the research really validates that follows suit, that when you smile, it's hard for someone to scowl at you when you're smiling at them. Right? And there's power that's there.
I remember once a friend of mine told me, try looking up at the ceiling with a goofy look away and smiling really big and think a depressing thought.
Yeah.
And you can't do it.
You cannot do it. You cannot do it. You can't do it. I commonly will just sit there driving up here. Right? Because I had a long weekend. I actually played a comedy in a comedy show in the background. I was listening to this sitcom and just laughing, listening. I wasn't watching it. I was driving. Trust me, I was driving. But I was just laughing, listening to it with some of the humor and the jokes. And that just lowers the stress. I love it. I love it.
Yeah. The first one of those is spirituality, which is interesting. And a lot of people think about religion, which is it for some people. But you also describe practices that some might call more body awareness or attunement or calming practices. So how does deep breathing or meditation, how does that relate to spirituality for you?
It's a form of spirituality, right? So I have a strong religious belief too as well that's there. And so that was centered as a child growing up in prayer. And I was always taught that prayer is kind of me speaking to God, or some would say higher power, whereas meditation is me listening. and becoming calm. Now, what's so interesting about meditation is we found that there's power in meditation just by you meditating, or you just clear your mind, or you focus on nature and everything else, and it has huge benefits. But there's also huge benefits when you look and you realize that I'm a part of a bigger picture, that there is a process, that there's something, a purpose for me in life, and there's a purpose that I have, that the profound effects were even amplified. And so we see that this transforms. So a lot of the research is happening with functional MRIs, kind of looking and really delving into the fact that there is highlighting of certain areas of the brain. What's so interesting is that you deactivate the amygdala. So the amygdala is like this area that houses all of the memories, the traumatic memories, the things that lead to PTSD. And so when it dampens that area that's there, all of a sudden, I'm not as reactive to those triggers anymore. That all of a sudden it's going to enhance the empathy and enhance some of these other emotional centers inside of our brain. And that's very interesting, is the fact that science is catching up, that there's actually some functionality that we're seeing. Now, why does it happen? We don't know the why, but we're seeing it happen. We know it manifests in terms of outcomes and how individuals feel, but we're now seeing it too as well in imaging.
There have been studies done, double-blind studies, in which people were prayed for and not prayed for. It sounds like you're familiar with this. Can you speak to what we learned?
So I don't know those in detail, so I don't want to misspeak, but I know, if I recall correctly, there was not a huge difference between the two there. And so that, I think, almost implies, I would be interested in that study, and that if I went back and I were to construct that study, I would say, I would differentiate it this way. Individuals who knew that someone was praying for them versus individuals who didn't know someone was praying for them. And so, and maybe do a crossover. Why? Because the sense of support and connection, as opposed to the inference of a magical cure or manifestation that happens, right? Or a healing that happens from a higher being or from God. And so I think it's a combination of effects. So I would be very curious. That's how I would probably construct a study like that. I don't believe that study was constructed in that fashion, and I don't think it showed a favorable outcome or a significant outcome, clinically significant.
I think you're onto something with that. And it brings up the question of the placebo effect, which I want to ask you about. Can you talk to the placebo effect and why maybe the notion of trying to control for it is a bit misguided in some cases?
It's tremendously misguided. So what I'll tell you is, I love the placebo effect. I wish at some points I had become a neuropsychologist to kind of really delve into some of these things. So interesting. For those who are listening and don't know, one of the key things about placebo effect is that we're really testing the brain. So we're saying every therapy out there, every medicine, everything else, we're going to test that you have to beat out a person's power of belief. That's really what we're saying, the power of belief. Now, that belief is tied to so many things. That belief, your belief in something I tell you, could be based on my education, my diploma, how I carry myself, what my office looks like, how I convey the information to you, the empathy assigned to it. But what ends up happening is you respond. And so when we're saying that, we're saying, because we give you a pill, a sugar pill. Why a sugar pill or an inorganic a pill that will not have any biochemical functionality in your body, right? And so we compare that to something else, and you have to statistically be superior for it to be successful. It's likely a combination of both, because both entail a level of belief. So we're saying that this pill carries with it, this therapy, there has to be some belief attached to that, just as same as the other. So I think it's important. There's a lot of great work that's been done by Leah Crum and out of Stanford that's looked at this. And so in different realms in exploring the impact of placebo effect in terms of it. We've done studies within medicine for years too, as well with it. So I think the power of belief is strong, right? And that can, and it can really lend itself in some instances to healing. I think one of the most interesting components was that when they did testing to look for allergic reaction, and telling someone that this is going to help versus something that's going to make it worse for an inorganic substance, it actually triggered it, an allergic reaction based upon their belief in what that doctor said.
Wow.
I mean, it's powerful when you start looking at things like this, like the belief and so forth. And it lends me back to, in Western science, we have limitations in our construct. And that's why the saying of not everything that counts can be counted. And not everything that can be counted counts. And it's hard to count the impact truly or of things like placebo effect, or I'll say the power belief.
So it seems like there's no way to placebo control for a dietary change, because people know if they're eating broccoli or
That's
not,
right.
and that you can't fake that.
That's right.
So it's interesting, though, as I understand it, placebo effect does tend to wear off over time.
Yeah.
So people may get a sudden spike, but you won't tend to see it for years and years.
Correct.
With major chronic health conditions,
That's
for example. And that's one way we can know that lifestyle medicine is more than just people think it's working.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, when it comes to, as it pertains to lifestyle medicine, we're looking at that connectivity between diet and belief. The belief is what gets someone started, believing obviously that this can work. But the action is really what has to take hold after that point in time, and the consistency with it and incorporating that into the lifestyle. And so when we're looking at this, that's really what we say the epitome of epidemiologic studies, looking at large scale individuals and their eating patterns that are there. But when you look at double-blinded crossover studies, that's about the closest that we can come towards swapping diets and seeing what happens in terms of, in other words, what I mean by that is that if I take two groups, one group I feed them animal-based, whatever, burgers and fries, the other group I give them whole food plant-based, black bean burgers and salads and everything of that sort, and I look at their outcomes after a certain period of time, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 months, I then switch them. And then I see what happens to each group. That gives us, and there have been studies looking at that and seeing what happens. And we're seeing still favorable results that are there.
I believe there was such a study done with, or something along those lines, with African Americans and Africans. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So tremendous study. What they did was they took, I believe it was in Pittsburgh, and they took African Americans in Pittsburgh who were eating the standard American diet. So we know what that means: burgers and fries, fried animal products, chicken, etc., all the variables, and took the South African diet, which is a predominantly plant-rich diet, rich in fiber. And they tested them for the markers, the precursors for colon cancer, and found elevated levels inside those from Pittsburgh. Then they swapped the diets, and low levels, obviously, inside those from Africa. Swapped the diets. But what's so powerful about that is that within 2 weeks, they turned off the markers of colon cancer inside the African Americans who were then eating the plant predominant diet, and turned on the markers inside those from South Africa. So just tells you the power of it. And, it's like a quote from Alexander Chase. It says, "A shocking occurrence ceases to become shocking when it occurs daily." So I'm no longer shocked by the results of studies that come out. I'm no longer shocked when I have friends or family who have marked improvements. I think the problem is societal, is why people can't. It's because the foods that we are eating, it's really helping to offset our stress. And people are looking for an immediate answer for it. They're looking for an immediate answer. The stress level is beyond belief high. And so if I can have something that's going to be a comfort food, that's going to alleviate my pain in that second, realizing that it really doesn't, because it dissipates and it furthers this vicious cycle of consumption of it that then downtreads your mental health because you feel bad about it, and it continues on and on. If we can recognize that and get to the business side of things, that can really lend itself towards helping to stem the tide of this onslaught, the availability and access to things.
Do you think that ethics should play a part in dietary recommendations?
I don't see how it cannot, right? I mean, if I have full knowledge that a product that I'm giving you can cause harm, that literally can cause you to have diabetes or increase obesity or have heart disease or stroke or cancer, and I still continue to give that, that's a moral issue. And it moves us into a realm beyond social determinants of health, which really is something that's become a buzz term for communities of color and communities at risk, but really is a globe. It's a across the board. It affects everyone. And we have to transform into moral determinants of health. What are our morals? How are we looking to transform the system in terms of the foods, from a standpoint of the foods that are accessible to individuals? And is that really right that then now we're having to, on the other end, come up with medications and pills? And we're worried about the healthcare crises on the other hand, and we're impacting the academics. So when we feed a child poor food, we understand their academic performance is bad, right? That's a stressor. Mm-hmm. We know that academic performance is tied to poor health outcomes. Mm-hmm. That poor academic performance then lends itself where they're not going to be likely to have financial stability. They're going to be more inclined to have unemployment, which is tied to poor health outcomes. Financial stress, poor health outcomes. Now, as they have these poor health outcomes, whatever job that they have is going to be curtailed due to disability. And we see a higher burden of disability, which means during that working years of life, now the cycle continues that their kids are now financially distraught in the same situation with food that's subsidized to be extremely affordable for someone who is financially distraught. And now this vicious cycle is just this continuum goes on and on generationally.
Give us some hope.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hope is, number one, all of us have to vote with our dollars, I think is the beginning of everything. Why do I say that? The business of business is business solely. We see more vegan, plant-based options in stores all across America over the past 5 to 10 years. 20 years ago, that wasn't the case at all. 30 years ago, you didn't see plant milks or anything. It was a powder, you mix it with water, it was chunky, everything else like that, right? Why is it? Was it because of altruism? Was it because of ethics that manufacturers decided to go ahead and provide these options? No. It was financial. It was the demand. It was the business. They saw the trends. And that's what led them that way. That means it was the grassroots dollars that counted. That's one tangible way that we can go. The second way that we can go is we can impact our kids. This is something that's tax dollars that go towards our kids' schools inside public school system. That means that our representatives, our senators, our mayors, that our voice matters to them because they want to be reelected. Mm-hmm. And trying to change the tide of direction at that foundational level with our kids, because guess what? If you reach the kids, I can't tell you how many people I've met who said, oh, I started this when I was in junior high or high school, or I read about what happened with animals, or we got a challenge, or I tasted this and I started and kept on, or I participated in a community garden. And there's so much power of influence at that young foundational age that can take hold for generations. And so those are simple things that we can begin the process of doing. And then obviously at a large 30,000 foot level, it's going to require major political restructuring, in terms of our approach towards things. And you know more than I do about working at that level. It's so important really to make the political determinants of health, right? Yeah. Because that influences the subsidies, the reimbursement, the availability, and so forth. That becomes important. It reminds me of, I saw this little clip where they use advertisement for vegetables, and they create a campaign of broccoli versus kale. And it was so interesting, this campaign, and it took on a wildfire, and all of a sudden they saw the sales increase, right? And so amazing. But why isn't that done on a regular basis? Because the money's not there. Mm-hmm. The money's not there. The profit margin isn't there. The business of business is business. But our business is health. Our business is wellness. Our business is trying to narrow disparities that are out there for everyone. And so that oftentimes means there's a disconnect. And so I'm not naive to think that from an agricultural standpoint, there has to be massive shifts in order to provide food. We're providing food, bad food, to places that historically have had good food. And so if we can accentuate the good food that's already there in those places and build on the lands in which we're using as just crops to feed animals that are slaughtered, we're in a better state overall.
Yeah. If you were speaking to somebody who is unsure whether the trouble to change their diet is worth it, what would you say to them?
When I'm really looking at for individuals over the course of time, the key is, what do you want? What do you really want? What do you want right now? What do you want in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? What do you want life to look like? What's important to you? The second part of that is, what are you willing to do to get what you want? And what won't you do to get what you want? When I speak to patients on a regular basis, one of the key things I tell them, and everyone can relate to this, I said, do you have Social Security tax taken out of your paycheck? I said, yeah, doc, I do. Do you have to put money into your retirement? Sometimes it's no, but many times it's yes. I asked him, I said, why? Well, so when I retire, I have money. I said, why do you need money when you retire? So I can live the life I want to live. I said, so why don't we do the same thing with our health? Why don't we invest in our health for our health future? That means by what we pour into it, by our choices, every single day, what we choose to eat, this is adding to our future. Because what good is the money if you can't live healthfully? So you have to invest in your health if you want to live and see your family, if you want to do the things that you enjoy and live a life of purpose. And that's my message to everyone. It's my message to myself. I'm not saying I'm perfect in life, but what I'm saying to you is that I'm intentional in life. I try to be intentional every single day in what I choose to do, how I choose to respond, what I choose to eat on a regular basis, and make a conscious decision of what this is adding to, resiliency or stress.
We've been talking with Dr. Columbus Batiste, cardiologist, author of the forthcoming book, Selfish, and an inspiration to so many. Thank you, Columbus.
Thank you.